There's really no societal communication. Our failure, I would say Pakistan has its problems. That assuming Pakistan is our enemy, then we should be even studying them a lot more.
So this week in Rajamandala, you've taken an interesting topic, which actually we don't discuss that much anymore, which is India and Pakistan, India's interest in Pakistan. Not counting how much we talk about Pakistan vis-a-vis our our international relations, state-to-state relations, but what actually happens in Pakistan and how little interest or how little influence India has in that regard. Everyone should read the piece. It is a very interesting one, of course. It's on indianexpress.com and there should be a link wherever you're watching this video. First question is, so what do you think is responsible for this disinterest? Is it just that we're so caught up in the polemics and the politics and the, at least in sections of the media, is bashing Pakistan or representing because of the conflict? The sort of Pakistan bashing has become so paramount that we can't look at it with nuance anymore as a neighbor and a very important neighbor.
Yeah, I think the two immediate reasons you can sense. I think one is the congealed conflict between India and Pakistan, and the context has become a lot more polarized in the last few years. Although the relationship is under far better control than it was, say, in the early 90s, when there were frequent conflicts, there was far more terrorism. But today, the kind of polarization that has taken place in both the societies, I think that's been one problem. Second, I think because of the diminution or the absence of any people-to-people contact, there's very little exchange, there's very little communication and contact. What little there was in the early 2000s, when the media, there was a lot more interaction. At least there was some visits by political parties, there were some visits by activist groups. Really, I think it's ground to a halt. There's really no societal communication. And the third, I think, is the failure. I think it's our failure. I would say Pakistan has its problems. That assuming Pakistan is our enemy, then we should be even studying them a lot more. Like if you see the Soviet Union, the kind of US, the amount of resources it devotes to understanding Russia or China, now in particular with China. We just have no attempt to understand what's going on in their society. Yes, start with the assumption you have a serious problem with Pakistan. Those problems have to be, we've tried hard, we've not made progress, but then you got to take a far more differentiated view, what goes on in that country, what makes that country tick, what are the different political factions within that. I think we make very little effort to understand that, barring maybe in the government and the intelligence agencies. There's very little attempt to understand what is going on at the academic level, the very few expertise on the regions. So I think we take it for granted, since we are cut from the same cloth, we have the same history, we were part of the same country. Everyone assumes they know it, but we pay very little attention. If you ask an average person to name a few political parties in Pakistan, or a few political leaders, there's nothing. We keep reacting to official statements from their state, from the government, rather than connecting with the people. And I think that's really, it's becoming a constraining factor in itself, besides the objective conditions that make the relationship difficult.
So the second question for India, and I think even in Pakistan, and perhaps now we see to an extent in Bangladesh, do you think the fact that a lot has been written about this in recent times in a different context, but is that the fact that our domestic politics is in that sense still so intertwined with, whether it's a question of religion, and because that was the basis of the partition of the subcontinent, do you think that makes it so much more difficult for, the fact that for the minority community in India, and I'm sure there's equivalents in Pakistan, the slur is to call someone Pakistani almost. It has become a term of abuse. And in that context, do you think that, not taking up for a second, when you say, there's a phrase you use, the tactical and sort of a tactical engagement at the margins, as in the piece, there's this phrase used. How far do you think it is even the larger discourse is affected by that kind of politics, which is not new in one sense? That's been one of the defining features. Equally so in Pakistan. Nawaz Sharif I mean, his outreach to India was back then widely perceived as one of the reasons that the Pakistani army shut him down, much as you say in the piece. So how far do you think that is responsible, and that how is one to sidestep that issue when writing about either country, in either country, or engaging with it or thinking about it?
Look, I think the partition and the bitter legacies of partition, I think they're living reality in the subcontinent. I mean, in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, there's no escaping that. I mean, we've tried to transcend some of that. We've had some success with Pakistan, with Bangladesh. We resolved the boundary dispute. There's a lot more trade, communication, contact. Yet, even then, the issues that left by partition of Bengal, where there's migration, those issues continue to haunt the relationship. At the slightest trigger, they explode, as we've seen in recent weeks. And with Pakistan, there is even very little contact. I think that's part of the problem, that the partition generation at least had empathy, there was bitterness, but there was also familiarity, and understanding. That generation has largely passed on. And after that, the understanding, the nature of contact has significantly diminished with Pakistan in comparison to Bangladesh. And I think that is a problem. And I can understand at the popular level, the kind of power of partition. But where is our elite? Why is it that the Indian political parties make no effort to reach out, even the so-called secular parties, that there is no effort to reach out? It's because everyone hews to there's some kind of a Lakshman Rekha that you don't want to cross. But what stops the Congress party or the whole range of other parties which have had, which are links with similar parties, like, the Congress party, you can say, is very similar to the People's, the PPP in Pakistan, but we don't. So, but there's no attempt at engaging at all. And if you noticed, that unless we begin to do that, you don't get the nuance. And then you had the situation because, for example, Nawaz Sharif was very eager to see how we can transcend the relationship on the disputes. Then we had Zardari before him, was very eager, say, look, let's put aside Kashmir, let's do business, let's do trade and travel, let's do, so to get on with life. We couldn't make much progress because I think in Pakistan, there was a lot of opposition to it. There is an interesting twist today, which is, if you look at the last 10 years, it was the civilian leaders who were saying they want more engagement with India. But today it's Imran Khan who is taking a hard line on India and is using the religious argument to further diminish the relationship, while actually General Bajwa, it's very interestingly, if you remember, he oversaw a ceasefire negotiation and his talk about, some kind of, let's move from geopolitics to geoeconomics, and his hint that, look, we can have some kind of a minor trade relationship, we could start with that. But it was Imran Khan who vetoed that. So I think even to understand the shifts within Pakistan, that it is not the same group of people who take the same kind of position. Even for that minor variations within the constellation of stakeholders within the Pakistani politics, we need to do more. And here I would blame the elite and our political class, our media, for not really, doing any due diligence. It's just into the bashing exercise rather than, or the other extreme, oh, we are brothers, so that you light candles at Wagah. So there is no in-between position of hard analytical look at what goes across the border.
There's just taking forward from what you said, for example, this shift, which is a fascinating, it is an interesting shift that what Imran Khan relying on, and let's call them soft fundamentalists, if not proper, relying on a sort of religious mobilization to keep the army at bay, which is something that, for example, we've been so focused on Afghanistan and how that will affect cross-border. Something like this will actually has very real repercussions for India's borders. And we're not looking at that. But do you think part of it, how do we take this kind of, say a basic first step, because I remember, if I'm not wrong, a few months ago, maybe last year during the pandemic, which could have been a great opportunity to say, just have more conferences, more dialogue, more just talking people to people, as you're saying, at the intellectual, at the policy level. But the government, for example, I think, do you think part of it is also now in the part of the state, a certain politicization of every aspect of even foreign policy? Because they said any contact with Pakistan, I mean, any conference that you have to get clearance. So as a university, or let's say as a newspaper, like we do idea exchanges, like I'm having this discussion with you, for me to do that with, say, a columnist or the diplomatic affairs editor of Dawn, requires at this point 4 levels of permission and clearances, for to have an interaction. Do you think just easing those basic things to begin with might be a good first step?
I think, most of the time, I mean, going back, there was a time when I started my career in a think tank. So to get Pakistani papers, newspapers, the Pakistan had put so many restrictions that we used to get it through the embassy after 2 weeks, packed in a huge pile, and then opening those newspapers and trying to read them. Since then, today there's a much greater access to internet. I think there is, in fact, in a way, we are emulating Pakistan. That because they do it, we're also doing it. But I think as a larger country, as I keep reminding you, that our economy is 10 times bigger than Pakistan's. We have problems with Pakistan. That's why it's even more important for us to engage different parts of the Pakistani society. So my sense is there are other things. Look, yes, I mean, the attempt to control internet communication or seminars is real. But there are other ways in which you can, relate to each other. I mean, nobody stops us from meeting in Kathmandu or some other place where so it's, states can't completely cut off. But the problem is not that. I think we are so focused on the state-to-state relationship and not dealing with our political class must be finding a way to relate to the political class, which we do in Nepal, for example, we do in Sri Lanka. There's a lot more contact with Bangladesh, but there's nothing at all left with Pakistan. And I think that's where our real problem is.
I think that, so do you think, I mean, this is just, I don't know, it'll go in the final video, but, so why do you think that is? What is this great? Is it just that our elite is politically, as much as any other elite, has become just too complacent, is not willing to make that effort, or it's too caught up? Do you think it's part of, for both countries, but particularly for India? I mean, the joke used to be that Pakistan is obsessed with India. I mean, we do loom large over their politics. But do you think the reverse, in the sense the opposite is happening in India as well, that we've become so insular, including our political class, that insularity is somehow preventing us? We're also becoming a little too obsessed only with India. Do you think part of it is that?
Yeah, I think, it's a paradox that, look, whatever we say in India, every little statement gets magnified in Pakistan. There's a continuous debate, but they have very little knowledge, but they're kind of obsessed with India. And we are completely indifferent. I think that's where, where we really don't, accept, okay, somebody makes a statement, we are reacting, the whole, TV channels go crazy, but we are essentially indifferent. And I think there is a deep insularity in the Indian elite, which is, even in a globalizing era, we become far more insular. I mean, I think that's, again, one of the tragedies of the last few years. We have so few foreign correspondents, we have so few, communications. If we go back to the national movement, the huge amount of outward orientation of the Indian nationalists, they were engaging everyone in the world. Tagore traveled every corner of the world, Nehru or the socialists, the communists. So there was an expansive international connection. So while the business side, investment, trade have increased, at the political level, I think our minds have, closed down in many ways. You have all your students go to the US. We all know what's going on in the US, but within our neighborhood, I mean, there's much little awareness, whether Sri Lanka or Pakistan. Pakistan is the worst case. But even with our other neighbors, we barely pay attention to their tragedies, their stories, if you will. I mean, we don't have to empathize with them. We don't have to support them, but even to understand what is happening in the neighborhood. I think partly, while on the foreign policy side, you can say, look, we are still really a single civilizational space. What happens in one place affects the other. Therefore, intellectually, you can see why we need to do more engagement when we say neighborhood first, etc. But in the operational level, because we are tied to the state-to-state connection, and that unless we find open up spaces where we can communicate more broadly with other societies, I think we're going to constrain ourselves. In the end, it's about self-interest, that if we don't know what's going on, if we don't understand the nuanced argument between Bajwa, General Bajwa and Imran Khan, because there is other argument, which I mentioned in the article, which is, look, we think this is one lump. Pakistan is one black box. And that there is no room for change. There is no room for differences within them. It doesn't really matter. So I think that's the other problem that compounds the indifference by assuming absolute uniformity on the other side.
Great, sir. Thanks so much. Hopefully someone will act and we'll open up a little more soon. We'll see you next week. Everyone, the piece is on the IndianExpress.com. Do read it. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Akash.